Very good. So as Alistair said a moment ago, we've seen this huge variety of headlines, news headlines over the last, few years, but even these are just in the last few months about, Taiwan detaining ship captains, EU spending billions of euros on undersea cable protection, Putin's secret weapon, whether cables are this underbelly and this vulnerability of modern internet. So I hope that what we'll do tonight is dive a little deeper into some of these headlines, look at some of the key themes. What I want to talk about is this heightened geopolitical climate and how it's playing out on the seabed. We want to talk about how states in the Indo-Pacific are responding. We want to talk a little bit about how we should think about seabed competition, and of course, how Australia adapts. And this is work that I'm doing. So I have two active research projects, one with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and another one with the Department of Defence, which looks at this seabed critical infrastructure policy options Australia has. But just to kick off, so Richard Marles, our Minister for Defence and Deputy Prime Minister, he said at the Indo-Pacific Sea Power Conference a couple of years ago that 80% of global trade is seaborne and transits sea lines of communication. He said, quote, "The truth is that our sea lines of communication are fundamental to our way of life and also to our prosperity." But importantly, the figure that Marles gives doesn't include global trade that transits seabed lines of communication. So this is the ones and zeros of our digital lives and transiting cables and also pipelines. So in actual fact, it's not just telecommunication cables that do transit the seabed, but there's also a range of electricity cables around the world, gas pipelines around the world. But I'll focus this evening on submarine data telecommunication cables. Now, when it comes to these cables, around 98% of international data is transmitted across the seabed via these submarine cables. And these optical fibers are capable of ever-increasing speeds, so terabits per second, capable of handling ever more capacity, so more fibers per cable. They're connecting more and more landing stations than ever before. And these routes are constantly expanding and growing. And when we talk about the data, the ones and zeros, what I'm talking about is internet traffic, of course, but not just that, it's private communications or email, banking data, stock market data, medical data, scientific data, government communications, data center traffic, so cloud computing, streaming. If there's any students, anytime you're using ChatGPT to help with an essay, that's probably going through a cable as well. And really the bulk of our data is going through these 600 or so seabed hose size cables at the bottom of the sea. It's not in the cloud, it's not wirelessly, it's not through satellites for the bulk, but it's seabed lines of communications. And now what I want to do is I want to give a little exercise. I'll just use my phone instead of that. I want to do something that's crazy mundane and you may think incredibly boring, but what I want to do is I want to go on BBC Breaking News and just see what the headlines are. And then I'll talk to you about how this got from the journalist's keyboard to my phone right now. So I just went on, Gaza's really taking the headlines today. So a story about UN aid to Gaza came through right now. I just did that 5 seconds ago. And really, there's a complex array of dynamics of how that actually got to me. And what I want to do is I want to go through the geography of the infrastructure and the way that that request got to me. So of course, I just typed in BBC News into my phone. That was converted into ones and zeros electronically through the chips on my phone initially, but then transferred to light through fiber optic cables. So that would have gone out to a tower somewhere outside just then. It will be transmitted, and this is most probably, there's a complex array of factors into how it's actually getting, but I'm just going to give you an example. Probably transmitted terrestrially across to Perth, across the Nullarbor. Will reach a data center probably in the industrial parks in Perth and gone to a cable landing station. Most probably it will go out of City Beach in Perth. Will transit, you can follow along with the map here, follow the Sunda Strait, so transit through the Sunda Strait maritime choke point and arrive in Singapore. It will then head west through the Malacca Strait choke point, cross the Bay of Bengal, pass south of Sri Lanka. It most probably would reach Mumbai. then continue westward past the south coast of Oman and then onto the Gulf of Aden between Yemen and Somalia. And of course, due to the conflict going on in Yemen, there's still a lot of cables that are out in that part of the world and repair is incredibly difficult. So my request that I just put in will then transit the Bab el-Mandeb choke point, also known as the Gates of Grief, and enter the Red Sea. The ones and zeros then traveled northwestward to the Gulf of Suez, terrestrially across Egypt, which has been described as one of the world's most dangerous places for the internet. It then went westward through the Mediterranean, past Greece, Italy, Libya, Algeria, through the Strait of Gibraltar. The final run would have taken it into the Atlantic, past Morocco, Portugal, Spain, France, before finally landing in Cornwall and going to whatever servers the BBC is using in the UK. And all of this took place in a matter of seconds. And of course, it all came back the exact same way to my phone in that instant that I looked up the stories. So next time you look up global news or you send someone a message anywhere around the world, or really you use your phone in a variety of ways, think about how that data is getting to your phone. It's not through the cloud, as I mentioned, it's not wirelessly or through satellites, but it's seabed lines of communications. So I've got about half an hour. I've already taken about 10 minutes. So I'll speak for about 40 minutes total, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer, inviting comments, questions, whatever you have. I'll divide it into 4 parts. So what I'll do first is I'll just give a bit of 101 on cable network anatomy, a little historical context, a little about the cables and some economics. I mean, this is the Australian Institute for International Affairs, so of course we have to get into this vulnerability in this international heightened geopolitical state. So we'll talk about the cables and vulnerability, both these regular kind of outages that take place, but also this seabed warfare, and I'll explain the question marks that are there as well. And I'll end with a little bit about how I think it's important to think about this in this framing of this second Cold War that's on network centrality. Network anatomy, very good. So we'll start, I mean, this isn't new. This is, you know, a lot of all these headlines I've been showing are all very, very new stories. But of course, cables have been laid in the seabed since the mid 1800s. I've got this is a diagram. It's not super accurate. There was actually more routes. It wasn't just one. But this is essentially Britain's All Red Line, the global submarine telegraph network that was inaugurated in 1902, which connected all parts of the British Empire. It was called red because the British Empire was often red or pink on maps. And importantly, for security purposes, all red line links were made landfall on British colonies or British controlled territories. And that was a key security feature of this system. And the second historical example is that I want to talk about. So that's a connectivity historical piece. And on the resiliency side, so this is a picture of at the Cocos Islands in 1914 during World War I, when the German cruiser SMS Emden, so it raided Direction Island on Cocos Islands with the specific objective of destroying the cable landing station infrastructure. And of course, Cocos Islands back then was a key hub in global telecommunications networks. And interestingly, it's just been reconnected in the last couple of years after many decades of not having a connection at all. But the attack really demonstrated the vulnerability of these isolated telegraph relay stations that were key nodes of the British telecommunications network. It's quite interesting, actually, the folks on the island, they actually knew that this German raider was in the area. So before it landed, they hit a lot of equipment. And when the Germans came ashore, it was actually quite friendly, quite convivial. And the British said, look, you can destroy the communication station, but we've got this tennis court. We have to live here. Please don't destroy it. So, and essentially the Germans were more than happy to do that. But of course, while this was taking place, the HMAS Sydney, which was steaming off to Europe, found out that this German ship that had been causing havoc was there. And this was Australian Navy's first battle ever of its history. It was in Cocos Islands, essentially over submarine telecommunications infrastructure. So I'll play very briefly. I want to share a resource that everyone can play with after this talk. And this is this amazing interactive map. And I'll just point out a few key features of the network. Let's see if I can do this. Here we go, I can. So if you go on submarinecablemap.com, I'd really encourage people to play with this. It's a really fantastic resource. in which you can essentially see global telecommunications and its geography. The first point, I just want to point out a few items here. So you can see the connections Australia has. Is that coming up? Yeah, it is very good. So you can see that Sydney is one of our big cable hubs, as well as Perth. But having said that, there are more landing stations being built and in operation at the moment. But you can see here this real westernization of internet infrastructure. So sorry for those on Zoom, but you can see Hawaii as a really big hub, and you can see Guam as a really big hub. You'll also notice, when I go to the Indian Ocean, that a lot of these cable routes, they really follow sea lines of communication. So the shipping routes that all of our goods take. So you can see the Strait of Malacca is incredibly busy here with cable infrastructure. Strait of Hormuz, Bab el Mandeb in this side is incredibly busy as well. One interesting, I follow Indian Ocean security affairs, and there's always been this talk about whether Thailand will have a canal so that China can overcome its Malacca dilemma of not having to route its goods around the Strait of Malacca. But essentially what you can see here is we already have a digital canal that crosses Thailand. So it's already happening in the digital space in many ways. So I'd really encourage people to play with this map. You can click on individual cables and you can see a bunch of data about its length, the supplier. It's Chinese one. We'll get into that in the talk. But this is a really fantastic resource to play with, to see the geography of the internet. And of course, it doesn't exactly follow these routes. These are more indicative, but the landing stations, of course, are accurate. See if I can get back to this. I can. Very good. So I'll talk very briefly about cable anatomy, essentially, because when I talk about these cables, I say cables very flippantly, but really we should talk about them as a network, because the cables are just one small part of these. So, I mean, cables need to be electrified. So you can see this this cut diagram, but essentially cables are electrified to power the repeaters that are at intervals along the line. There's also, of course, the landing stations are really core elements of these networks, and network control centers that could be at landing stations, but could be operated remotely as well. And of course, we actually have the glass fibers that are within, and the lasers that are powering these things. So we shouldn't just think about the cable, but it's really this more complex array of equipment and from this infrastructure. I'll speak just very briefly on economics. And in terms of cables, I mean, the costs of these infrastructures are huge. And the costs with costs seeming to increase every few years. So you can see these pictures. So this is the construction costs of submarine cables. Huge amounts of money being spent in 2024, 2025, and 2026. We also see worldwide internet bandwidth growth over the next this is a historical graph essentially, but I mean essentially our thirst and our demand for data is just continuing to grow quite high. When it comes to Australia, so proportionate to global averages, significant sums are invested into submarine cable networks that do connect Australia, of course being an island. So of the $28 billion invested in new cable networks between 2014 and 2023, 3.4 billion was spent in Australia, which is 12% of the global total. And according to Terabit Consulting, of the 15 billion set to be spent on under construction and high credibility proposed submarine cable projects, about 1.6 billion will be spent on Australian cables. So the cable networks that are connecting Australia are ever expanding, and these networks shouldn't be viewed as static or as fixed infrastructures. I have a graph here of global demand for internet traffic, again, which just proves this huge rise in demand globally and the corresponding importance that are placed on these cable networks. So I'll speak just briefly about a few examples of what I mean by a submarine cable network. And this is one of the much larger cable networks. This is CME 6, which stands for Southeast Asia, Middle East, and Western Europe 6. So this is, I think it's still being completed at the moment. And you'll see here, there was a bit of controversy about the suppliers of this network, but we'll talk about that in the competition part of the talk. But this is laid by an American firm. But what's important here, you can see the length, 21,700 kilometers, so a huge network. And you can see this big list of owners. So essentially a range of telecommunications companies from Bahrain, Bangladesh, Bharti Airtel from India, China Unicom. And this really shows the consortia ownership model of a lot of the cables in the last 30 years or so. A new cable that's connecting Australia that's worth mentioning is the Oman-Australia cable. So this is a $30 million cable that was launched late in 2022. And essentially, I've raised this one here as this is actually the first connection back to Cocos Island that there has been for many decades. And Cocos Island was shot up during World War II as well as World War I over its cable network, but that's just more of a historical bypoint. This also connects Diego Garcia, supposed to be secretly, but some good Reuters journalists got a hold of that one and broke that story. So that was just a fun fact about this cable network. But the last one that's worth talking about is cable economics has moved from this consortium model to more of a lot of these what's called hyperscalers. So the Googles, the Metas, the Amazons, and Microsoft that are playing a bigger role in terms of commissioning these cable networks. And essentially, very broadly speaking, they say, well, we have the bandwidth to be able to justify these types of networks. We'll still sell some, but we can do it ourselves and we don't need all of these telcos being involved. So this is just one example. This hasn't been built yet, but this will be Australia's first connection to Africa. Essentially, you have a terrestrial link down through the heart of Africa and then across from South Africa to Perth. But we'll move to the cables and vulnerability. So what I want to talk about is some of these issues, is essentially why these networks are quote unquote vulnerable, some of the routine kind of breaks that happen, but then also talk about some of these issues we've been seeing in Europe, this quote unquote seabed warfare. And I'm writing a book on this at the moment that should come out later in the year. And there's a little bit of theory I want to test out with people, so do bear with me. But what I've been trying to do is conceptualize what it is about these cables that makes them vulnerable, essentially. And I've come up with these 3 points, this transmission, traverse, and constrict. So when it comes to transmit, what I'm talking about is that these cables enable information flows to transcend terrestrial boundaries. And a lot of people say, oh, well, cable, it's international traffic, but it's not international. It is, but it's also much more complex than that. And what I'm talking about is there's cables within states, cables to territories, cables to within empires, to alliance networks, to conflict zones, to diplomatic networks, within international organizations. It's not international. We've got to stop seeing it as only international, but this much more complex way of information is transmitted. Of course, these infrastructures enable critical infrastructure networks to operate. And as modern digital society relies on data transmission for its basic functioning, this transmission piece is really important. The second element is traverse. Now, these submarine cables traverse vulnerable maritime and coastal zones. So what I mean is the high seas, the contested seas, maritime choke points, conflict zones, and even congested seabed areas. So now we're seeing the potential for seabed mining. We're also seeing more pipelines, more electricity cables. So the seabed in this sense is getting congested. And by virtue of these infrastructures being located in the maritime domain, which is often beyond any state jurisdiction, states are driven by this unique subset of factors to assert influence and control over these networks that are essentially in the global commons. I'll just put this back down. The last point here is this constriction. And what I mean by this is that essentially you've got all of this data from cities, from around the world that's being constricted into these 600 or so conduits, thereby submarine cables. And this enables, censorship, shutdown, control, sanctions. It affords signals intelligence collection. I mean, for those who remember back about 12 years, the Snowden revelations was essentially all about, sorry, not all, but a large part of it was about the way in which submarine cables are used for what they called upstream collection. So signals intelligence collection. And this constriction means that supply sovereignty is really important, that repair capacity is really important. And I'll get to a few more practical examples. But essentially, these 600 or so cables, what we see is about 150 to 200 faults that occur every year. And these are caused by natural, commercial, recreational hazards. So according to the International Cable Protection Committee, fishing and anchoring accounts for approximately 70% of damage to these cables. And it can also be caused by earthquakes, landslides, volcanic activity, and extreme weather. Access and maintenance repair services are also really, really important. So when these cables break, which is routinely of about 600, we have about 200 breaks. So that's a third of them. I mean, rough maths are breaking each year. That prompt access for these repair crews is really, really important. There's also regulatory inadequacies. So obviously states manage them in their territorial waters and in their seas. But in the high seas, we rely on UNCLOS as the primary, but not only, international regime that handles this. And a lot of countries don't fulfill their obligations under UNCLOS. So what I mean by that is criminalizing any negligent or any behavior that damages these types of infrastructures. Australia is actually quite a good place in this regard, but most countries don't do that. But importantly, it's not sharks. So this is, there is a bit of an internet myth that, especially in Vietnam, that when cables go down, it must be the sharks. And even we see a lot of media reporting, there'll be a researcher that says, oh, about 0.1% of breaks are sharks. And of course the headline says, oh, sharks damaging cables, but it's really not. But look, these are the business as usual issues. But what I want to do is I want to consider this heightened geopolitical landscape that we're currently in and looking at these types of new threats. And now we shift to this seabed warfare. And of course, I have the three, more than one, but three question marks, because it's important that a lot of these cases, nothing's been confirmed about whether it was sabotage, whether it wasn't sabotage, exactly what the nature of it was, despite the media reporting that you'll see saying, oh, it was the Russian Shadow Fleet. So I want to caveat that it's very murky, it's very uncertain. The break will get the headlines. The police saying, oh, it wasn't anything, won't get the headlines. But nevertheless, this is prompting huge responses globally. So it's still important to talk about. But when we talk about what is seabed warfare, it's, quote, operations involving undersea networks and systems capable of operating on the seabed, interacting with seabed systems and taking actions against those systems. So essentially what we're talking about is seabed warfare referring to operations incorporating the seafloor, targeting cables, whether that be data or power, sensors and energy transmission and extraction infrastructure. And I'll give a bunch of examples, and I've got a lot of pictures here as well. But the one I don't have a picture of really kicked a lot of this off was in late November 2021 in Norway, when the Norwegian Marine Research Institute, its ocean observatory, was out of service after about 4 kilometers of cables were dragged away. Do you want to fix it? Is it me or is it?
It may be the connection. Let's just grab it.
Yeah. It's probably me. Is that better? All right, we'll give that a go. It's probably the sharks, exactly. And essentially in late 2021, I had we'll keep going. That's all right, we'll keep going. You want me to keep going? The pointer. Put it there. We'll try that. Okay. So essentially 4 kilometers of its cables just disappeared. They did find it later, but there was a lot of suspicion on what caused that. In January 2022, cables connecting Norway's Svalbard satellite station were severed due to what police described as, quote, human activity. And there was, try another one? Yeah, sure. That's right.
Yeah.
All right, try again. So in late 2022, cables connecting Norway's Svalbard satellite station was severed in what police described as human activity. And Svalbard's a really important military, as well as civilian satellite station, really in the heart of the Arctic up in Norway. The jury's still out on exactly what caused that. I hope people know what this is. This is the Nord Stream 1 and 2 sabotage incident back in September 2022, when 3 explosions were reported in September 2022, as I just said, which destroyed 3 of the 4 individual gas pipelines. And this connects Russia with Germany and then on to a range of other countries. This hasn't been repaired since. I don't think that, with the current geopolitical climate, nothing's going to happen there. But this was really a catalyst, as well as a few more incidents that I'll go over. So the next one is the new polar bear. People probably heard the headlines. What a great name for a ship. And on 8 October 2023, the Baltic Connector, which is a bidirectional natural gas pipeline that connects Finland and Estonia, as well as 2 submarine telecommunication cables, were cut by a dragging anchor. Now, Finland blamed the Chinese-owned, but Hong Kong-flagged new polar bear container ship as the prime suspect. And this ship is linked to Chinese and Russian governments. A few months later, China did admit that this ship did sever the infrastructure, but it was accidental. And it's taken a lot of months for this Baltic connector to be fixed. And we have pictures here of the missing anchors, and this is one of the anchors that they actually dragged back up. So this was October 2023, but things really, I don't know if people were following, late last year, things really hotted up. So this is a picture of the Yipeng 3. And this was an incident that really rattled Europe. And all of this is the Baltic Sea. So on 18 November 2024, 2 submarine telecommunication cables were severed under suspicious circumstances. And this bulk carrier, the Yipeng 3, dragged its anchor while traversing the Baltic Sea and severed these cable networks. Germany's defense minister at the time said, quote, "We have to say, without saying exactly who it came from, that this is a hybrid action. We also have to assume, without knowing it yet, that it was sabotage." But what's important about this and the next case I'll talk about was, rather than letting the Yipeng 3 depart the Baltic Sea, as the new polar bear did, the Danish Navy actually pursued and intercepted the ship, and European warships surrounded the bulk carrier while investigations took place. So after about a month of diplomatic delay, on 21 December last year, China allowed the German, Swedish, Finnish, and Danish investigators to board the ship. But later that day, after the boarding had taken place, it departed and resumed its regular activity. The next and last incident that took place in Europe was the Eagle S incident. And this is a picture of the Eagle S with the Finnish Coast Guard. So while investigations were still going on into the Yipeng, another incident occurred this was Christmas Day last year. It was a busy Christmas last year, in which this Cook Islands flagged oil tanker, the Eagle S, fouled 4 submarine communication cables, as well as an electricity cable also in the Baltic. So again, this ship was seized on Boxing Day. And in a really spectacular operation, Finnish border and police and border guards commandeered the vessel, took charge of its bridge, and held it in Finnish waters. Do you want to swap? Okay. That's all right. All right. Third time lucky. Here we go. Eagle S. And importantly, if this ship wasn't stopped very rapidly as it did, its anchor would have impacted more cables. Where is this coming from? The Eastlink 1 submarine power cable within about half an hour, and it would have destroyed the Baltic Connector gas pipeline, which was destroyed about a year or so earlier, within an hour, if this interdiction didn't take place. And importantly, the Eagle S is thought to be a part of Russia's fuel tanker, quote, shadow fleet, which circumvent Western sanctions imposed due to Russia's war in the Ukraine by bypassing, and they bypass Western insurance regimes. They're usually aging ships with obscure entities, obscure ownership entities. But closer to home, we're seeing incidents off Taiwan's coast. So this is a picture of Taiwanese Coast Guards boarding a ship that they claim, or they believe, had deliberately cut an undersea internet cable. So this was a Togo-flagged vessel and crewed by 8 Chinese nationals. Taiwan's Coast Guard. And so this one's still playing out to an extent. The final example of what's happening, this is a really spectacular picture. So this is the Ruby Ma motor vessel, which was sunk by the Houthis. Sunk by the. You want to- Could be. I know they're tracking me. Yeah. So this one, this is the Ruby Mar. This is a ship that the Houthis actually sunk in the Red Sea. What was this? This was back early 2024. And while it was sinking, it dropped one of its anchors, obviously not that one that's there, but essentially in the process of being sunk, it fouled a range of submarine cables in the Red Sea. And of course, we saw those maps that the Red Sea is a really important area for cable connectivity. And of course, crews don't want to go and repair these types of infrastructures in the Red Sea in these war zones. And the Houthis actually say, look, we're not going to target telecommunications cables. Like they actually said that in a statement. But if you're sinking ships in that area, you know, everyone knows what will most probably happen. How are we going for time? We're doing okay. So just that's the resilience side. But what's just as important is this regional connectivity side. And really the way in which these cable networks are playing into great power competition. And now we see this big competition about amongst the 4 global companies that dominate submarine cable laying and installation. So we have Subcom from the United States, a big American leader. We have Alcatel Submarine Networks in France. So interestingly, the French government reacquired Alcatel Submarine Networks from Nokia in a statement about how important this is to France's national interest. NEC in Japan is also a major provider, and HMN Technologies that we have here as well. So this was formerly Huawei Marine, divested due to US sanctions, but remains China's primary vehicle in the submarine cable space. And what we see are these big geopolitical strategies that are playing out on the seabed. So of course, China's Digital Silk Road was launched in 2025 to support its digital champions and promote their global expansion. HMN Tech really serves as China's primary vehicle extending influence in submarine cable infrastructure. And submarine cable market share is really one of the core components of China's strategy to reshape global digital connectivity. Of course, the West as well is doing exactly the same thing. So we're seeing significant investments in competing cable projects and capacity building. So even amongst DFAT, they've established an Australian infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific, which is doing a lot of work in investing in submarine cable networks with the suppliers that Australia is comfortable with. We see American, Japanese, Australian trilateral initiatives in the Pacific to fund new cable initiatives. DFAT has stood up the Australian Cable Connectivity and Resilience Centre, for example, and the Americans do similar work. And we see a few flashpoints. So Coral Sea being one of them, and the East Micronesia cable projects. Essentially, think back to when we were barring Huawei from our 5G telecommunications infrastructure. The same thing was happening in the seabed space, in which China's interest in these types of projects was really being countered by projects from Australia, United States, and Japan. There's a few strategic implications, but I'll get to all of that in a tick. But what this points towards is, will we see this internet bifurcation? This is, I'm just preempting a question that I often get. With this race to produce for regional connectivity. And I mean, what we're seeing is new geographies. And we have here, I mean, this is a picture of new cable networks that are connecting Southeast Asia and East Asia to the United States. And the United States won't let any Chinese suppliers lay any cables to connect it. But what's important here is you can see that the South China Sea, I think the word was blocked. You know, essentially China won't allow any type of, in a broad sense, laying or repairs in this space. So essentially this is being avoided, and we see routes going through Indonesia and then off across the Pacific. And mostly only Chinese laid cables that are connecting China. But importantly, we see this, so as in this is this second map. But what we're seeing is this real avoidance of the South China Sea. Now I'm gonna go here and then go back. So this is a diagram of the networks that have been laid by HMN Tech and its predecessor. And what we see is this is still quite small number. There's about 40 here, and a lot of these are actually quite small networks. There are a few larger kind of transocean networks, but a lot of them are a lot smaller. And what the importance here is that Chinese firms still need to rely on non-Chinese laid cables to transmit data. But if I go back, this is an image of all the non-HMN tech laid networks. So you can see that essentially it's very easy for Western companies to avoid Chinese cable networks. And this successful thwarting of China's cable ambitions has really been quite pronounced. But in the final 5 minutes, what I want to do, I want to just talk briefly about how I think it's useful to think about this. And essentially it's this model of a second Cold War. The first Cold War, of course, US-Soviet competition, was primarily driven by territorial control and by military blocs. And of course, we have the blocs here. And this is zero-sum competition, ideological battle, containment. But the Second Cold War is really a war over centrality for global networks. So these networks that transcend terrestrial boundaries, and importantly, power comes from controlling the critical connections, so the nodes where these networks are laid. And this is infrastructural networks, so we look at Belt and Road and American-backed alternatives, production networks, so global value chains for strategic advantage, financial networks, so we see the way in which the US dollar is used for strategic dominance. But importantly, the fourth is these digital networks and the formations of these competing technology stacks. So for hardware, software, it's increasingly becoming fragmented by Western and Chinese options. The implications for submarine cable security are fourfold. So the first one is there's this increasing appetite for network control. So when both powers seek to influence who builds, who owns, who operates, and who secures these cable networks. So both sides are trying to expand global cable infrastructure. They're both concerned about potential data interception and disruption. And again, really importantly, these controls of nodes and flows are really important. So landing stations and connecting points really become these strategic assets in this second Cold War. When it comes to the smaller countries, in this model, in the first model, we see you have to join a bloc, but now you don't have to. You can have this omni-alignment or this partial alignment in which countries can hedge and pick different elements of both networks that are on offer. We also see this exploitation of vulnerability, so a weaponized interdependence, essentially the ability to leverage network positions for intelligence, surveillance, or coercion, and these new partnerships that are forming around these types of networks. So the key points really are that submarine cable security exemplifies this network-based competition of the Second Cold War and not territorial blocks like the First Cold War. And of course, winning is very difficult. Winning conclusively is very difficult. And its future could involve these types of fragmented networks with degrees of integration. But all we know is there's this need for new security frameworks to account for this complex network competition rather than traditional territorial defense concepts. So I'll spend 2 minutes just very briefly getting back to the concrete and talking about what are some of the policy options Australia has, and then we'll open up for some questions and comments. So despite all of what I've said, there's this significant gap in how Australia approaches this, I would argue anyway. So our civil maritime security strategy is silent on seabed critical infrastructure. And our 2024 National Defence Strategy focuses on the underwater domain pertaining to submarines, of course, and mines, but no mentions made of seabed lines of communications at all. According to Royal Australian Navy doctrine, the seabed is, quote, an increasingly important source of resources, but it doesn't posit any strategies. And there are other countries that are leading the way, especially in Europe and France. But in terms of some of the points that I've raised in the past on what we can do about this, I mean, the first one is, of course, integrating seabed critical infrastructure into defense strategies. So this would be definitions, it would be frameworks, it would be seabed knowledge, seabed monitoring, operations and doctrines. The second one is really defining the governance of seabed infrastructure responses. So who takes the lead when these types of incidents take place? There's a lot of new and amazing sensor technology. This is just an example of one, but technologies that are being built into the cable networks themselves. So really harnessing that is really important, but also learning the lessons of when we see these types of near misses take place, what do we have to do differently about it? Of course, industry is absolutely critical in this. So, and I think, government does do a good job in that sense. And this issue of repair, of in peacetime, repair capacity is fine, but if we are going into a more contested environment, how do we manage repair? Is there some type of Australian option? Is there some type of Quad option? We're seeing China doing it, United States doing it, India looking at doing it as well. So just as some takeaway points, I mean, this isn't a new topic by any means, but it's really intensified due to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and also due to the Sino-US tech competition. We should expect some of these kinds of suspicious incidents happening more often in the Indo-Pacific. And we do, of course, have all these various options available to us. There's no one service or agency that's responsible. So, what's Defence Forces' role? What's Border Forces' role? There is a myriad of different groups. But in any case, I'll keep digging into this over the next year or so. And I hope this has been useful and relevant. And I really welcome all the questions and comments, and hope the industry folks can tell me where I've gone wrong.